two, one, two, three.
Hello, and welcome to Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America Presents. My name is David Foote. I'm an activist and organizer with the Ithaca chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm joined today by co-host Theresa, who has been admirably running this show for a very long time and is one of our most outspoken and committed housing justice advocates. We've invited a guest on today to talk about housing issues, Caitlin Blanchfield, who's an architectural historian and a member of Ithaca DSA. Caitlin, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So the topic for today, as I mentioned, is housing, which is an important issue that connects equality, community, comfort, access to transportation, education, and more. Specifically, we'd like to talk today about an issue that I'm sure I could learn more about, the ways that zoning rules govern what is and isn't possible for either using existing housing or building new housing here in Ithaca and beyond. These laws, zoning laws, can be somewhat difficult to untangle, so I hoped that Theresa, Caitlin, both of you could help us sort of shine a light on this topic. So to get right into it, my understanding is zoning laws connect to urban planning. They're sort of born out of this theoretical and practical practice of urban planning. And they govern how a property can be used, whether that's residential, industrial, commercial, even mixed use. But it turns out some of these things are not necessarily so clinical or scientific. They can be impartial, they can be sort of a metric for increasing inequality at times. Can you summarize what zoning laws generally look like and outline any misconceptions people tend to have?
Sure, thanks for the question. And I'm going to start out with a definition from UCLA's Lewis Center for Regional Studies, which defines zoning as a collection of rules cities make to determine what can be built and what uses can occur on individual parcels of land. And I like this definition, I think, because it really underscores how kind of broad the category of zoning is. As you were saying, David, there's a sense that maybe this can be an extremely sort of clinical or scientific or relate specifically to, the use of a property. But, it can be really something like from how many residential units can one parcel contain, to something like street parking requirements for housing. And I think both of those are things that we face here in Ithaca.
Yes.
And, so zoning decisions are typically made at the municipal level. There's also zoning decisions that can be made at the county level or the state, and we might talk about that later. But typically this is something that happens within city government. It's definitely part of planning, but I think planners would kind of see their role in shaping urban development and urban communities, urban life as kind of much more than that. And just like maybe a little bit of a history of zoning, which in some way, shape, or form, I think has existed for centuries all over the world. But in the US, zoning laws really started probably around the early 20th century in response to basically industry and housing in close proximity in urban areas. So like, tanneries and slaughterhouses next to apartment buildings. So trying to kind of separate industry from where people live and pollution from, dwelling spaces. And like New York City's 1916 zoning code is seen as, really hallmark kind of introduction of zoning at a city scale to again, divide industry from residential and business areas, bring more light and air into dense parts of the city. So we can see that there's advantages to zoning, and zoning maybe came about to try to create, healthier cities, to kind of put a check on the externalities of capitalist development. But zoning also has explicitly and also implicitly very racist and classist history. So some of the early zoning laws in US cities implemented race-based zoning, enshrining kind of segregation into municipal law by determining neighborhoods that would be white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods, essentially. And this continued through policies of redlining, which would designate hazardous neighborhoods that would then, you could not get a home loan to buy property in these neighborhoods.
What do you mean hazardous? That it's dangerous to live there, or that it's dangerous to your finances to invest there?
I think that it would be dangerous to your finances to invest there. So this was like the term that cities would use to basically, literally put red lines around neighborhoods that were communities of color. And this is kind of the legacy of, I think, racist zoning through what's called exclusionary zoning. It's something that, cities are really starting to grapple with now. And I think that planners have been really working to undo for decades.
So to zoom in a little bit, what does this look like here in Tompkins County? Do we have a lot of zoning, a little bit of zoning? I know we have a mix of very rural areas, a lot of student housing, an incredibly disparate range of incomes here in the county. What does it look like here in Tompkins and in Ithaca?
Well, Caitlin used the word cities as though, of course, zoning was a city thing. And indeed, there is one city in Tompkins County, the city of Ithaca, and it has had zoning since, I think, the 1920s. However, counties are not allowed to zone in New York State. Municipalities, which can be cities or towns or villages, can have zoning or not, if they so choose. And it's a patchwork in Tompkins County. Ulysses, the town of Ulysses, has zoning. I know that because it has a BZA, a Board of Zoning Appeals. And so does the village of Trumansburg. Enfield, as far as I can tell, doesn't. No, Enfield definitely doesn't, because they did a survey there and many people said that they liked living in Enfield because there is no zoning. And some people said they thought Enfield should have zoning. Newfield, no zoning. That's why it was possible for second wind cottages to be built there. One of our prize, developments for housing the homeless. Couldn't have done it. Probably couldn't have been done in a place with zoning. Danby has zoning, has a Board of Zoning Appeals. In Caroline, the idea of zoning is a controversy, a big public controversy at this moment. And if you have been reading the local papers like Tompkins Weekly, you've probably seen letters to the editor or op-eds where, well, some people are just blasting the idea of zoning and others are saying we need it. The town of Ithaca has zoning. The village of Cayuga Heights has its own zoning, very, what shall we say, persnickety, of course. A lot of it's zoned for large lawns, around houses and limits on the height of fences that you are allowed to erect. And that caused a little kerfuffle some years ago because people wanted to build higher fences to keep deer out of their ornamental plants, and they weren't allowed to do it under the zoning law. But apparently there wasn't enough of a, the law wasn't changed to meet that. It could have been. I mean, it's just something local, a local law. You can change them. I remember a funny story. I think, well, maybe I won't mention the name of the person, but she lived in the town of Ithaca before there was zoning. And was at her back fence chatting with a neighbor, and the neighbor said, "That's a terrible idea to bring in zoning," because it was, and this friend of mine tells me that she said, "Yeah, you're probably right. I was thinking of starting a pig farm," which I think converted the neighbor to seeing the usefulness of zoning.
Perhaps. Now, Caitlin, you talked about exclusionary zoning, and one of the ideas that was shared as we planned this interview suggested that the cost of homes could be set by the law, not by demand, not by the need for people to have places to live. So what is exclusionary zoning? What are the consequences of this?
Right. So exclusionary zoning refers to zoning ordinances and legislation that kind of dictate stipulations around residential units, around housing, that make that housing accessible to a very limited demographic of people. So, for instance, single family homes, zoning for single family homes, so that the only houses in a particular area, can be single family homes, makes then housing, only available to those who can afford that. Similarly, lot sizes creates, again, that one must be able to afford a lot of that size to live in this neighborhood. And so, I think those are kind of the big things that people think about with relationship to exclusionary zoning, is mainly really the focus on the single family home, which is, a huge problem in this country. I mean, even in Ithaca, where within the town of Ithaca, I think it's either a lot of what's called R1 zoning, which is single family homes, like one house on a property, or R2, where you could have potentially two families living in one unit. So, and again, this is also it's predicated on the family unit, which then also becomes exclusionary for maybe less traditional ways of living together.
Cooperatives, you mean?
Right.
Perhaps. Yes, I remember a fellow socialist explaining that a couple in DSA at that, or maybe it was DSOC at that time, lived in a neighborhood where, as he put it, they don't even have three unrelated cats, because they had a mother cat and her two kittens.
Well, we've talked about the theory, some of the practical effects of this. Theresa, one of the things you had identified is that the City of Ithaca Comprehensive Plan dictates two contradicting goals for land use. Goal number 2 in the comprehensive plan, that additional housing will provide opportunities for people of all incomes to live in the city. And goal 3, that neighborhood character will be preserved and enhanced. Now, what here is the contradiction, and how are we to respond to it?
Well, the contradiction is that there are neighborhoods like Upper West Hill or Bell Sherman, let's say, where the character has been this kind of single family house with a fairly large lot around it, at least large compared to some of the more central parts of the city. And as Caitlin said, that's an exclusionary thing because you have to have a fair amount of money to buy, not just the place you live in, but all the land around it. So
Yeah, I mean, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
so I was going to say that just, it's discrimination on the basis of class.
Right. I mean, and when I hear this phrase of preserving the character of a neighborhood, to me, that raises a lot of red flags of kind of, well, what is really meant by that? What is this a euphemism for? Who defines the character of a neighborhood? Who gets to arbitrate if it is preserved or not? And often what we're trying to do, I imagine, like in a city like Ithaca, is make the city more diverse, welcome people, house more people. Cities don't have to stay the same. They are changing, they're improving, and becoming more accessible. So sometimes this language of preserving character can really be a sort of not in my backyard euphemism of a very kind of conservative status quo.
Yes, and then something that changes whether we want it to or not is the climate. And we're seeing the need to have less reliance on cars and more ability to walk and letting people live near where they work, letting more people live closer together. These are needs now.
Yeah, I think we can say that in order to fix the situation, there's really not much we would hope to preserve as it is. We want to open up opportunities and make possibilities realities. And as we look at fixing some things, not just housing, but many issues that affect people living in Ithaca, outside of Ithaca and beyond, sometimes the solutions are already being enacted, already being sorted through in other areas, and we can borrow from things that have worked in other places, proposals that have been made. What ideas are out there? How can we use zoning? How can we work around zoning to have a more equitable, more equal society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good question, and one that I think, fortunately, many cities and many urban planners are addressing right now. And I think definitely one of the things that can be done just in terms of zoning itself is to get rid of single family zoning. So get rid of this kind of what is now the R1 designation in Ithaca, for example. And cities are doing this across the country. So Minneapolis has gotten rid of single family zoning and is now bringing in instead, I think it's like up to 3 units per lot. In Oregon, they're also getting rid of single family zoning. And I think now in Portland, any lot can have up to 4 units. So, just finding a way to basically increase density, create the option for more housing, different configurations of housing. Again, it might be a 4-plex. It might be that, it's a lot where the owner rents out another unit. Giving the kind of flexibility for more of like a middle ground of housing that isn't either single family or the necessity of building like a big residential complex, which involves a lot of investment and developer money. So I think that that's definitely one thing. Also, accessory dwelling units is something that in New York State has been getting attention recently. There's a bill that's been put forward by Assemblyperson Epstein, and I think it is in the state Senate Kavanaugh, who have just reintroduced a bill on what is called accessory dwelling units, which basically allows someone to build another housing unit attached to their house or in their yard, like a smaller kind of apartment or something like that. That's a kind of easy way to just open up more housing. There's many benefits, generate more income for residents who might be looking for second income, allow older people to age in place, and also is a way to do this without kind of relying on big developers coming in and building multi-unit buildings.
Well, it'll have a hard time there. It was proposed a couple of years ago. And again, from Bell Sherman from South Hill, the people just flocked into council chambers. And there was one meeting where they absolutely let go and talked about how terrible renters were, or how terrible rental properties were. Some of it was, I think, a little bit inaccurate. I can say that at this moment, the two rental properties on each side of me have been cleaned up quite nicely, but mine's still a mess because I try to do all my own gardening and I can't keep up.
And yeah, there you go. This kind of like very classist rhetoric against renting, which coming from New York City is, I find, surprising. But again, hopefully something that would come through as state legislation would then, allow people to just bypass whatever Common Council thinks about ADUs, because it would be state law. And I know there was similar controversy around being able to subdivide lots, which is another possibility that cities and towns have put on the table. So I think there's this fine line between fears of development, but also a kind of, again, this not in my backyard. We need to preserve the character, the kind of home ownership model of the town. And I think, in addition to changes in zoning, which I definitely think are necessary and helpful, what many planners say is that, like, yes, this is important, but also it's really about urban planning, about like kind of working with communities, organizing. I think in Minneapolis, this recent repeal of single family zoning happened because of, community organizations and planners kind of working together. And I think that will really allow the particular needs of residents to be put front and center, like putting housing near transportation or near services that people need, so that, the city becomes, or town becomes, accessible.
Walkable.
Yeah, exactly. And as Theresa was saying, with climate change, like that becomes even more important, but also makes living in a place more affordable. And then, and lastly is also just investment in housing. Like, housing is a right. Everyone deserves affordable housing, and that, won't happen just through reform solutions that allow the market to do what it does, like create more units or something. It also requires, the state to really invest in housing people.
Yeah, well, another very problematic issue that has had some fights around it in Ithaca is minimum off-street parking requirements, which most of Ithaca has. And there are a few zones do not have it. The very central College Town district with high rises, and I think similarly in the very central core of downtown, again, where high rises are being built, they don't have you don't need a car to live in those places. And in fact, apparently some of the slightly earlier apartment developments found that they had lots of parking and it wasn't even being used because it was close, close enough to campus to walk.
Yeah, and I mean, similar, I think that lot size requirements, or especially around this conversation around accessory dwelling units where, only a certain percentage of your lot can be devoted to the other unit to preserve a kind of sense of a yard or whatnot. But that also kind of creates limitations on possibilities for housing.
Although it's interesting, here we are, two socialists advocating accessory dwelling units as a solution, and yet on a recent national DSA housing justice commission call. No, it was not the call. It was the Slack. One of our leading housing activists and policy wonks was absolutely slamming the idea of auxiliary dwelling units, ADUs as they're called, because he says each one of them creates a new landlord. I think Irold actually wrote back and said, I don't think that having one rental unit turns you immediately into an ogre, but
yeah, and I mean, within the landscape of what of landlords in this moment, where there's so many of these like huge corporations and investment firms buying up apartment buildings, there's so many more predatory versions of a landlord that yes, it would be great if there weren't landlords, but I do think this is something that in a place like Ithaca could be introduced in the short term and make an impact.
Well, thank you both. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm David Foote, joined by housing activist Theresa Alt and architectural historian Caitlin Blanchfield, both DSA members and believers in a better future as far as getting people into houses. Thank you again for joining us.
1, 2, 3.